Before sunrise on October 25th, 1944, the sea east of Samar looked calm. 6 small American escort carriers were performing a routine mission, protecting the Leyte landings and launching aircraft against targets ashore. These ships were not built to fight battleships. They were slow, lightly armored, and guarded by only a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Then shapes like ancient Japanese temples appeared on the horizon. They were not islands or clouds. They were the towering masts of an entire battle fleet. Moments later, orange flashes lit the distance and enormous colored shells fell around the carriers. The Japanese used different dyes to identify each ship's fire. Suddenly, the blue sea was ringed by red, yellow, and green towers of water. Facing the small American force was Yamato, the heaviest battleship ever placed in service, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Only the group with the radio call sign Taffy 3 stood between them and the vulnerable landing ships. On paper, the battle should have ended within minutes. What followed instead made the battle off Samar one of the most courageous naval actions in history. To understand how Yamato reached this position, we must go back only 5 days. On October 20th, American troops landed on Leyte and began the return to the Philippines. For Japan, losing the islands meant more than losing territory. It threatened the sea route connecting Japan to oil and raw materials from Southeast Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy, therefore, committed much of its remaining surface strength to a large and complicated plan. Several forces would approach from different directions, while Japanese carriers with very few aircraft drew the fast American fleet north. Those carriers were bait. How did the Strait become unguarded? Here begins one of the most famous command and communication failures in American naval history. Admiral William Halsey commanded the Third Fleet, including fast carriers and modern battleships. When the Japanese carrier force was discovered to the north, he moved to pursue it with nearly all his strength. He believed Kurita had been badly damaged and no longer posed a decisive threat. Farther south, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet protected the Leyte operation. Its officers believed Halsey's force would cover San Bernardino Strait, or that some of his battleships had remained behind. No such force was there. The failure was not a single disobeyed order. It was a chain of messages, assumptions, and ambiguous wording between 2 different commands. The result was a vast opening. Taffy 3 was not guarding the strait and was not prepared for a surface battle. Its aircraft were mostly armed with small bombs and depth charges for supporting soldiers and hunting submarines, not armor-piercing weapons capable of stopping battleships. Around 6:50 in the morning, contact reports began arriving. Large ships to the northwest. Within minutes, it was clear that the force everyone believed had withdrawn had emerged from the strait, while the nearest heavy American ships were far too distant to save them. Kurita's force appearing before Taffy 3 contained 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. At its heart was Yamato, armed with 46-centimeter main guns capable of throwing shells weighing more than a ton across enormous distances. Taffy 3 had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers were sometimes called jeep carriers. Built on merchant ship hulls, they could make only about 19 knots and carried just one 5-inch gun each for surface defense. Even the American destroyers, which looked large beside the carriers, were tiny compared with Japanese battleships and cruisers. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague immediately ordered every aircraft launched. The group turned toward a nearby rain squall, and the escorts began making as much smoke as possible. This was more than a thin screen. Ships burned fuel to create black clouds and released chemicals that produced dense white smoke. The carriers turned away at maximum speed while shells crashed around them. The Japanese initially believed they had found. Johnston was commanded by Ernest Evans, an officer of Native American ancestry who had made clear when taking command that he did not intend to run from a fight. When the Japanese appeared, he ordered every boiler lit and demanded maximum speed. Johnston began making smoke and moving between the enemy and the carriers. At about 7:10, her 5-inch guns opened fire on the nearest Japanese cruiser from long range. Battleships and cruisers answered with shells many times larger. Evans knew his guns alone could not stop this force. His real weapon was a battery of 10 torpedoes. To use them, he had to get closer. Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet, not away from it. She advanced through falling shells until entering torpedo range, then launched against the heavy cruiser Yamato. One or more torpedoes destroyed the cruiser's bow and forced her out of the battle line. Johnston paid immediately. Heavy shells struck the ship, cut her speed, and smashed the bridge and control positions. Evans was wounded, lost fingers from one hand, and had clothing torn by fragments. A passing rain squall concealed Johnston from Japanese eyes. Inside the rain and smoke, the crew restored everything they could. Then Johnston emerged and entered the battle again. By 7:30, Sprague understood that escape alone would not save the carriers. He ordered the screening ships to make a torpedo attack. The destroyer Hoel advanced, followed by Heermann and the smaller destroyer escorts. Sailors sometimes called such vessels tin cans because their thin hulls could not withstand battleship fire. Their task now was to place those hulls between the carriers and the Japanese fleet. Hoel attacked through crossing fire, launched her torpedoes, and continued shooting until repeated hits destroyed her ability to maneuver. Heermann raced between the ships and forced Japanese battleships to turn away from torpedo tracks. These attacks did not sink Yamato, but they temporarily pulled her away from an effective firing position and further disrupted Kurita's formation. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was smaller and slower than the destroyers, yet she also joined the attack. Her captain, Robert Copeland, told his crew that they were entering battle against overwhelming odds and must do their duty regardless of the outcome. The ship closed the cruisers, fired her torpedoes, and worked her 2 small guns at their maximum rate. Within minutes, the boundary between attack and defense disappeared. Every American ship was buying time for the carriers, and every minute the Japanese spent avoiding a torpedo or changing targets kept their guns away from the landing force in Leyte Gulf. Above the ships, another battle was unfolding. The carriers launched every aircraft able to fly, Wildcat fighters and Avenger bombers. Some carried weapons intended for ground targets, some carried depth charges, and others took off before they could be fully armed. The pilots attacked battleships and cruisers with everything available. They dropped bombs, fired rockets and machine guns, and made torpedo runs. When their ammunition was gone, some did not leave the fight. They returned in dummy attacks to force Japanese gunners to fire and ships to maneuver. Aircraft from Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 also joined, while some landed on Leyte to collect whatever weapons were available before returning. These were not coordinated strikes like those that sank Musashi the previous day. They arrived as scattered but relentless waves, leaving Kurita unable to judge the size of the air force opposing him. Below, the carriers themselves fired their single guns whenever cruisers came close enough. Smoke, rain, evasive turns, and air attacks divided the Japanese fleet into separate pursuits. Kurita had ordered a general attack instead of maintaining a controlled formation, and his ships advanced at different speeds. With every turn it became harder to understand the whole battlefield. The stronger force was still advancing, but it no longer struck as a single fist. Inside the smoke, one carrier began losing speed. Gambier Bay had suffered repeated hits and was falling behind the rest of the group. To the Japanese ships, she became a clear target. Cruisers closed and poured shells in her, while the crew fought fires and struggled to keep the ship moving. The escort carrier had no armor capable of stopping cruiser shells. At about 9:07, Gambier Bay rolled over and sank minutes later. She became the only American aircraft carrier lost to surface gunfire during the Second World War. Hundreds of men were left in the water. Shortly before this, Hoel had become a burning wreck. Her guns kept firing until the ship could no longer be saved, and she sank while still positioned between the enemy and the carriers. Samuel B. Roberts was struck by heavy shells that tore a gash more than 9 meters long at her side, destroyed her engine rooms, and eliminated power and communications. The order to abandon ship came at 9:10. At one of the afterguns, sailors continued passing ammunition until the end. These small ships could not win a conventional battle. They lacked armor, ammunition, and speed. Johnston could have withdrawn after her first attack, but returned to cover the other ships. She was moving on one engine. Her bridge was shattered, and communications had failed across parts of the vessel. At one point, she nearly collided with Heermann inside the smoke. Johnston reversed hard, and the bows passed with only a tiny margin, prompting cheers from sailors on both ships. Johnston then saw a Japanese destroyer group preparing a torpedo attack against the carriers. She opened fire on the light cruiser Yahagi and the destroyers behind it, while American aircraft helped force them to turn away. This became the last organized Japanese offensive action against Taffy 3. Johnston, however, was now almost surrounded. From about 9:10, she took repeated hits. Her guns failed one after another. The last engine stopped, and only a single gun continued firing under local control. At about 9:45, Evans ordered the crew to abandon ship. Sailors remained to assist the wounded and lower life rafts, while shells continued falling. Shortly after 10, Johnston rolled over and sank bow first. She had carried 327 men into the battle. 141 survived. Evans was later seen in the water, wounded and wearing a life jacket, but after that night, he was never seen again. Then came the decision historians still debate. As the American ships were being torn apart, Kurita ordered his force to stop the pursuit, regroup, and eventually withdraw north. Why? No single explanation is sufficient. The Japanese force had fought for 2 days, endured submarine and air attacks, and lost Musashi and several cruisers. Communications were damaged, ships had scattered during the general attack, and smoke, rain, and aircraft concealed parts of the battle from one another. The Japanese also misidentified the escort carriers, leading many to believe they faced a more important American force. Kurita received unclear reports about other formations and did not know that the path toward Leyte Gulf was almost open. American aircraft continued attacking, and Japanese cruisers suffered severe damage. Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya were ultimately lost from battle damage and air attack, while Kumano was badly damaged. From Kurita's position, this did not resemble an easy destruction. It looked like a chaotic engagement against carriers and destroyers that refused to stop fighting, aircraft arriving from unknown bases, and the possible appearance of heavier American forces at any moment. He chose to preserve what remained of his fleet. To Taffy 3, the withdrawal seemed impossible. Ships with no torpedoes left, some barely able to move, watched the Japanese columns turn away. Surviving Kurita's guns did not end the morning. After the surface force withdrew, Japanese suicide aircraft appeared over the escort carriers. At about 10:51, one aircraft struck the carrier St. Lo. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated bombs, fuel, and aircraft stored below. Explosions followed one another, and St. Lo sank, becoming the first American warship lost to an organized kamikaze attack. In the sea, thousands of sailors from the sunken ships clung to rafts or wreckage. Some waited more than 2 days to be found. They endured sun, thirst, wounds, and shark attacks. Rescue vessels eventually recovered more than 1,000 survivors from Gambier Bay, Hoel, Johnston, Samuel B., Roberts, and other ships. Not everyone survived. Taffy 3 lost the destroyers Johnston and Hoel, the destroyer escorts Samuel B., Roberts, and the escort carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo. More than 1,000 sailors died in the battle and related attacks. The Japanese lost 3 cruisers and a 4th was severely damaged. Most importantly, the transports and landing ships at Leyte remained safe. Kurita's battleships never reached the soldiers, ammunition, and supplies that would have been nearly helpless beneath their heavy guns. After the war, every ship of Taffy 3 received the Presidential Unit Citation. Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor after his death for leading Johnston's first attack and repeatedly returning to the fight. Robert Copeland, captain of Samuel B. Roberts, wrote of the calmness, courage, and efficiency of his men despite knowing the strength ahead of them. His report produced a phrase forever associated with the ship. There could be no higher honor than commanding such men. For decades, Johnston's wreck remained in the darkness of the deepest parts of the Philippine Sea. In 2021, its identity was confirmed at a depth greater than 6,400 meters. The number 557 was still visible on the hull, and the forward section rested upright on the seabed as if continuing its advance. The following year, Samuel B. Roberts was found even deeper. The meaning of Samar, however, does not come from record depths or from Yamato's size alone. It comes from a decision made by sailors on small ships when they faced a force they could not defeat in the usual way. They did not fight because they believed they were stronger. They fought because ships and soldiers behind them could not protect themselves. Taffy 3 did not destroy the entire Japanese fleet, but it confused it, delayed it, and helped convince it to withdraw. In a single morning, they proved that the outcome of battle is not determined by the size of the guns alone, but by what people decide to do when those guns begin firing.